My name is Christina McClellan, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
I'm the Chief Curator at the University of Iowa Museum of Art, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Gigi Durham. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Welcome to the third season of Women at Iowa, a show that explores the work, experience, and history of women on the University of Iowa campus. I'm your host, Anna Bostwick Flaming, and our guest today is Chris Brus, who is the director of the Women in Science and Engineering program at the University of Iowa. She's also the 2003 winner of the Jean Jew Women's Rights Award. Chris, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's an honor.
Well, so I know that you direct WISE, the Women in Science and Engineering program, and you have science degrees, yet you started your education majoring in music. How did that experience shape you?
Well, interestingly, in high school, I had two loves, science and music, obviously. And I realized fairly early on that the music would have to be done early in my life because I always wanted to have kids. And so it was the priority after high school. And I received a full scholarship to go to Wartburg College in Waverly. And that was fabulous. I had a really great semester there. But it was one of my first big events that started shaping my life toward what I do now. And looking at double standards and mixed messages that women get. So I received this full scholarship. We were actually preparing to go to Europe that next summer. And must have been late October, maybe early November. It became very clear to me that the director of the choir had some contingencies that came along with the scholarship. And we are talking about sexual favors. So I had a really difficult decision to make. Say what you want. When you're looking at your only opportunity to go to a school that has great music programs. I actually had a mentor there. It was really wonderful. Or I didn't know what he would do, actually, if I didn't sleep with him. But, I'm pretty principled, and I just said, no, I can't do that. So he pulled my scholarship, and after one semester, I was out. And you have to understand, this was at a time when I did not disclose this to my parents. I did not go to any of the administration because I knew how it would be received. And I knew that I would be the one being demonized and not him. I regret that, but I understand that situation where you have very confusing choices. And so I didn't tell. I told my mother about 20 years later. And she said, oh, yeah, well, they found out about 10 years ago and kicked him off the faculty. Well, but it didn't help me. So then I was kind of out. And then I just kept doing music. I played in a lot of bands. Went to UNI. They have a great jazz department, music department. So, the thing about music for a woman is that it's not that much different from a lot of the baseline concepts I work with for women in science and engineering. Because it's about being very underrepresented. It's about critical mass theory, what you can do and not do when you are one out of how many. And also about the assumptions that are made about you. So later on, I actually formed a 10-piece horn band. We bought a studio in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we went on the road for several years. Another woman was in the band with me initially, and the band was called Sisters. And the men in the band thought that was just fine because our rationale was we get called guys all the time. So you can be sisters. They were cool with that, which was great. But I'll tell you, the assumptions were pretty scary. If you were a young woman traveling with men on the road, and now we're talking very early 70s, they figured they knew what you were there for, which was not necessarily true. But So.
And you told me that you actually got fired sometimes when you were on the road. What exactly was happening there?
Well, we were just uppity women, I remember one time we were going down to play in Florida at the Button on the Beach, which is in Fort Lauderdale. And as we were driving into town, and this is a huge entourage. It's a 10-piece band. We've got 2 straight trucks, blah, blah, blah. And we hear an ad on the radio. It says, "Come down to the Button on the Beach and see the band's sisters with 2 girls who really know how to shake it." And we were really pissed. So we called them up and said, "Take it off the air or we're not playing." They took it off the air. But sometimes when those things happened, they would say, "Shove off." So, again, it's that thing about you got to decide where you stand. People have to do what they do. So sometimes it worked out well. We felt good about it. Other times it didn't, and so be it.
I've heard you tell a story about a manager who was surprised when he first met you. Will you tell us that story?
Actually, it was. We were playing down at a different club. We played in Florida quite often, and it was known to have some sort of syndicate ties. You get up a little bit in the echelon, and then you start meeting some interesting people. So Karen, the other woman in the band, and I got called up to talk to this guy. And first of all, whenever we'd go up to see them, we would have to go through the door one at a time, and then they'd close the door, and then they'd frisk us. Then you could go in one at a time. Really creepy stuff. But when Karen and I went in, it was so bizarre because we sat down. We had no idea what he wanted to talk to us about. And he said, and this is terrible, but it was like south side of Chicago, which is where I grew up. But he looked at us and he said, "I just don't know what to do with you girls. You got a lot of talent and no boobs." And we just sat there. And he said, "I don't know how to market you. I don't know how to get you jobs." And it was, again, one of those things that just really struck me about how many assumptions were being made. And they had no idea what to do with us if we weren't actually just filling a role of sexual plaything or whatever. So, yeah, it was an interesting time, and those things directly apply to what I do at WISE, which surprises people, but it's true.
So at about that time, you got married and had your children. What was it like to combine the obligations of family with your career?
Well, I actually waited to have my children. I have 2 daughters, and I had them at 31 and 35. So by that point, I was done being on the road because I really didn't want to have kids and be doing what I was doing. So I went back, and I had gotten certification as a cytotechnologist, which is through the American Society of Clinical Pathologists. And it is a microscope field where you look at slides that you've prepared of different parts, body parts, aspirations, etc., and you diagnose inflammation, you diagnose different kinds of cancers. One of the big parts of being a cytotechnologist is screening Pap smears. Still very involved in women's health care. So the focus just switched. And actually, it's interesting because I finally got out of the band. I took care of the money, and I remember going to the bank one day and asking them what day it was, because I had to sign this stuff to have them cash the check. And then I remember sitting there and having to ask them what year it was. And I said, okay, enough of this. I'm way too smart to be just kind of floating down the river and not paying any attention to what's happening out in the world. So again, then I went back and did my cytotechnology, worked in pathology labs, had jobs that actually gave you benefits, which was kind of important also. Had my two lovelies, and it was interesting because I thought it would be very difficult to be doing music and having babies. But at that point, I was then working in a pathology lab, a small pathology lab, and it was very difficult. It was the first time I had run into the idea that your employer owns you, owns your time, owns your loyalty. And it also was the first time I realized that the legislation that allows for 6 weeks of maternity leave is not applicable if you work at a place that has 20 or fewer employees. So I was back at work 10 days after I had my second daughter. You are forced to make choices that are very difficult in terms of career and family. And for me, family, through a lot of circumstances, but I ended up being a single parent, and my daughters took precedence. It's interesting at WISE now, when we talk to young women about negotiating for jobs, they always say, oh, well, should I tell them? Especially in engineering. Should I tell them I have kids? Should I tell them? And, I always say, well, that's your call, obviously, but you need to look first at how much you have to have this job. I mean, there are baseline, we work at places we don't really want to if we have to feed our kids. But if you have the option of looking for different jobs, where do you want to work? At a place where if you say that, they all kind of go, oh, well, I don't know if I want her as an employee. She's going to have flexibility, So I don't know what they do, but I always told them right up front. And I always said, I'm very loyal to my kids, and that means I'll be loyal to you. People are either loyal or they're not. They either take their responsibilities seriously or they don't. So it never seemed to be a huge problem, but I was very careful, especially as a single parent. Because I know that we can talk all we want to about quality time, but quantity time is important as well.
So your training, as you said, in cytotechnology also allowed you to help out the Emma Goldman Clinic.
Oh, yeah.
What were you doing for them?
Well, here I am, a person who's been performing in front of hundreds and thousands of people for years and years and years, and then I'm sick of people, so I end up going into a field where I'm sitting at a microscope like this all day, with no interaction with people. So that didn't work very well. So what I started doing was conducting little meetings with women's groups where I could talk about Pap smears or different female cancers, and I would take slides along and I would try and demystify the words, because I'm sorry, but the more professional we get, the more we hide behind vocabulary, and many people try hard to keep that distance and not bridge. Well, I'm just the opposite, and I think people are intelligent enough to be able to follow things. All you have to do is define them in a way that they can understand. And that does not imply that people are more or less intelligent. It's just that they've learned certain things in certain ways. So we can't even talk across disciplines at the university half the time because of technical terms and vocabulary. So it was also true that after having been in control of a lot of things while I was on the road and doing music, and it was very creative and very group-oriented, that I felt very isolated after a while doing cytology. So I loved the women at Emma. I started actually doing some of their Pap smears for them, kind of under the table, because there was a short time where the university was not doing their Pap smears. We used to get them at the university when I worked there, and we did them. So the only option they had was to send them out to what we call a screening mill in California. Very cheap, very high error rates. Scared me to death. So one of the things I did during that period was if we were worried about someone or if we got an abnormal result back, I would have the people at Emma take another slide and give it to me, and I'd sneak it in with the rest of my work. Can I get in trouble for this? I don't know.
We'll cut it if it's a problem.
I don't think so. And I found many significant errors that the lab in California was making. So I felt good about having that ability because, you know, people still die from cervical cancer. So it's not as if it's a minor concern. And it's also a place where women feel very intimidated to ask for information and get clarification and wonder, well, what does this mean long term when they're looking at abnormal PAPs and things. So I just did a lot of stuff with Emma during that period. So when the two old houses were up on, I never can remember, Governor or Dodge. And I also went with the midwives to help with births and things. And it was a really great time in Iowa City. Very open, a lot of things going on. People could disagree, but it was still very civil. You know, it was okay to have different opinions. So that was a really fun time for me. And I'm glad I was in Iowa City at that period of time.
So you started work on an MS degree at the University of Iowa, and you told me that you actually did research for 2 theses, not 1 but 2. How did that happen?
Well, I went to grad school as an older student with 2 small children. And when you go to grad school, they usually tell you, okay, find something that's really aligned with one of the people in your department, you know, because that will help you get through. Of course, I didn't do that, you know. I'm just sort of oppositional sometimes. But I wanted to use my cytology, use some of the things that I had learned working years and years in pathology. So I started working at the vulvar disease clinic at the University of Iowa and started working with a condition called vulvar vestibulitis, which is a terrible condition. It makes having intercourse very painful or impossible. And it's also one of those diseases that ends up in that area that I like, where you actually have a condition, but because it's not very well characterized and because it doesn't fit a lot of the patterns, what do we hear? These women will go in and the doctor will say, just go home and have a glass of wine, relax, then you'll be able to have sex. You know, just totally bizarre things, because or they would refer you to a shrink or a psychologist. And I knew, as did all of us who really worked with this, that it was a physical condition. And yes, they had secondary stresses, but the physical predated. So my first thesis was to characterize this disease. I came up with a mechanism for grading the intensity and severity and presented it at a couple of national meetings. But I was working with someone who was not within my department, my advisor. And OB-GYN went through a big change. A new head came in. And not just myself, but a couple of other people were then denied access to the clinic. So I was almost completely done, and I had to start over. So at least the second time, I did what they recommend, and I started working with somebody in my department, so that helped.
And what did you do for the second one?
Well, actually, my second thesis was really interesting as well, and again, it went across the boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries. There was no College of Public Health. This was before the College of Public Health was there, so I was in the College of Medicine. And I had worked on a pilot study with Chuck Lynch, looking at residential radon gas and female lung cancer. And that was good for me because I had to deal with all the pathologists and get the pathology reports, so of course I knew how to do that. But what struck me was, in the pilot, we would go out and try and administer a questionnaire that had been written for uranium miners. One of the criteria for this study was that the women had to have lived in their current home for at least 20 years, because we had to get spatial patterns where they were, and then we'd match it with the monitors for the radon gas around the house. And I just forgot where I was going with that.
So you were mostly working with women who had been in their home for 20 years.
Yes. So, interestingly enough, we were trying to give this questionnaire to a group of elderly women, many of them rural, and it had pages that listed things like, have you ever been exposed to beryllium, to, on and on and on and on. They had no idea, because that was not part of their body of knowledge. So then we'd bring them back, and what would the researchers at the university say? This is why I really hate working with women's subjects. They just can't answer right. They just give us rotten data, blah, blah, blah. Well, I got a little upset by that, because I was out talking to these women and they knew a whole lot of stuff. We just didn't ask it in a way that they could answer. So I started doing a lot of research in psychology and sociology about memory deposition and retrieval. And I came up with a new methodology for the exposure model. So we would do the radon testing, and that just gives you hard numbers. You have your canisters and you place them. Then what I was able to do was write a methodology that really worked for women in terms of we had to find out where they were spatially within their house and out of their house. So, we didn't, the original questionnaire said, during these 10 years, how much time did you spend on the first level of your home? I would not know that. So, what I would do is say, if the first level were the basement, say, okay, where is your laundry? First thing you do is you ask them where things are placed in the home. Where do you do your laundry? Okay. If it's in the basement, then you know what level you're talking about. About how many hours a week did it take to do your laundry in this period of time when your children were home? Because that's going to change. Got fabulous data. And after the pilot study, we went into the large National Cancer Institute study. And that methodology was really tagged with coming up with a much more sensitive exposure model that we could use. So that was very cool. But again, it was that cross-disciplinary sort of approach to things. And unfortunately, the person who helped me the most on the psychology, sociology side wouldn't actually sit on my committee, because he said that he had done that once before, been on a College of Medicine committee, and it was a really terrible experience. So I had to go back and forth between social science and hard science. but they would not come together. So I had to navigate the territory between them, and every time I'd go one way, I'd have to teach them what was on, I learned a lot. Some of it not so good about the way we function, but it was very interesting research.
So you finished this MS in preventative medicine and environmental health in 1994,
Yes.
which is the same year that WISE was established. But you didn't apply then. What did you do instead?
Well, I did see the first WISE ad, and I was very interested, but it originally was offered as a half-time position. And again, by this point, I was a single parent with 2 kids, and that was just not going to fly. And I also had the opportunity to move to Oakdale and work with Jim Merchant, who was the initiating dean of the College of Public Health. I have tremendous respect for Jim Merchant, and I came over and worked as the director of the Community Outreach and Education Program that was part of the Environmental Health Sciences Research Center, EHSRC, which is a federally funded center that looks at, again, I love this, looks at health, but in relationship to agriculture. So we've got, looking at environmental health issues. So it was cross-disciplinary, which was perfect for me. I got to do a lot of speaking. I got to work in the lab still. I was able to start a camp called Environmental, what do we call it? EHSI, Environmental Health Sciences Institute for Rural Youth. Because the population that I saw that was getting left out more and more often in this discussion about environment and health were those people who had a really solid background and grew up in a farming community. And we need them at the table. So I started this summer institute, only 15 students a year, and it did not cost them anything, which is important to me as well. If you're going to offer something that's for money, you still have to have scholarships because access is critical. And so they came into the university and they studied all sorts of really wild stuff. I'm so into exposure, So I had them down in the pathology labs because I love pathology. But we'd be down there looking at body parts and talking to the pathologists. Then we'd be out looking at Jerry Schnorr's phytoremediation site. Phytoremediation is your brow is a kind of engineering where you use plants to remediate an environmental hazard. And Jerry Schnorr in engineering has a really cool test plot out by the Amanas, so we'd take them out there. And these kids just were exhausted by the time we were done with them. But the cool part was they had to then go home. They had to have found something out of all the things we showed them that interested them. And they had to go home and develop a presentation, and they had to give it to at least one community group and one school group. Because we really wanted to complete that loop and have more of that information get back to their home communities. And these students had to come from towns of 2,500 or less, so they were very small. And then I promised that I would be at least one of their presentations. So in the fall, I was traveling all over the state, and it was actually really good. I loved getting over on the west side of the state because we aren't very visible there. The University of Iowa is not, and I just had a phenomenal time. So, again, it's an underrepresented population that needs to be at the table. Diversity is so tricky because it involves a lot of things. It involves myriads of perspectives at the table. And that's kind of my thing.
So in 1998, you finally began working for WISE after all of these years of experiences that were sort of leading up to that in many ways. You were instrumental in making that director position an equal pay for equal work line in the budget. How did you do that?
with difficulty. One of the things that was very interesting is I came from working with Jim Merchant at the Community Outreach and Education to WISE. And when I came over, it was the exact same job classification as I had had before, but it came with total responsibility, total fiscal, hiring, everything. And I thought, well, this doesn't make sense. I know WISE is small, but if you still have to cover all those bases, and mind you, we also had to raise all the money for our programs. We had a $10,000 budget and my salary. So it just didn't seem quite right to me. So after a year, when I felt a little more comfortable about what was going to be involved in this position, I actually went to David Scorton, who was my direct boss for a long time in the Vice President for Research office before I was president. And I said, David, we need to talk about this. Not only is it an issue of equity, but it's also an issue of institutional respect, institutional commitment, and people don't dismiss you quite as easily if you're director. Now, the funny part was I was still called the director, but it was not a director line. So it took 3 or 4 years to get it done. And actually, David was gone by then. Bill Decker was the interim. And so we were able to push that and get it through as a bona fide director position, which made me feel really good because going into the future, I had no idea how long I was going to be here. It just made sense to me that this really became a gender issue. So we got that taken care of, which was good.
So you've now been there a dozen years.
Oh, yes.
What are some of the most significant changes you've seen in that time?
At the university? At WISE?
All of the above.
Well, interestingly, I think one of the things that the institution itself is still struggling with and has had an impact on WISE, and I've heard from other colleagues who run especially diversity programs, that the last flood, you think, oh, that's just a physical thing, but I think it's changed the complexion of the university. We are much more disaggregated. We've always been kind of siloed in disciplines, but at least we were, you could go to the arts campus. And that was easily accessible, and you could go from, theater to music to whatever. And what we found most disconcerting was that, especially those of us who work with first-year populations, one of the biggest things we have to do is create positive community. Get these students to identify kind of a small university family, because it's a huge place. Well, we had no idea, and in fact, it took us a little while to figure out some of the dynamics that were going on. The IMU was closed. The bookstore had been moved to the mall. And when you deal with older students, it's a different ballgame. But for undergrads, the union is a real hub of activity. And when it was offline, we saw students struggling to find places to go. Where do you meet? Where do you congregate? Where you can just kind of sit or watch TV or, we don't do that in classrooms. It was very, very interesting. And our retention rates dropped. And we're still struggling with that a bit. Now we have the studio arts way off campus. We have music everywhere. It's in churches all over town still, etc. And some of this is not bad, but it really changed the feel of the institution. And not just for the students, I think for faculty as well and staff. So that's a big change that I think we still haven't come to terms with all of the ramifications of what the flood did.
And then what have been some of the major successes and disappointments at WISE?
Well, WISE is an incredible little unit, I have to say. I feel very grateful that I landed where I did. The young women that I work with are totally amazing. They're smart, but they're also connected. You know, sometimes I have to tell them, okay, you've done your 70 hours of community service for this month, you know. enough. Or I go to the dorm sometimes. We have a living learning community, which is 2 floors in Stanley Residence Hall. And I'll go in there on a Saturday night, and if they're studying, you know, I'm bad. But I say, get out of here. You know, I have to do very little to motivate my students to study. What I have to do is find out ways to get them, more times than not, to decompress a little bit. They are so serious about what they're doing. And they're just amazing. And so again, I remember one time actually when one of my daughters, my older daughter was about in 8th grade, and she looked really sad one day because I was talking about my WISE women. And she said, sometimes I think you like them better than me, Mom. Oh, okay, well, I better step back and include her in these things. She obviously knows that's not true. But I do feel like I have an extended family and that I have the opportunity to provide some context for these young women, both preparing them for some things that they may face, and if they don't, fabulous. But, you know, it happens quite often that in my undergrad population, if I ask about gender discrimination or bias, et cetera, they'll tell me to a young woman, well, we don't have that anymore. We don't have to deal with that anymore. So, and I don't rail on it. You know, we just keep trying to provide the kind of supports so they will have strategies when it does happen to them, when they do see it. And that is always a tough one for me, because some of the young women I've had for years will then be in graduate school, and all of a sudden they'll come back into my office and say, I just didn't see it before. And now I see it. And I see it all the way back. But I just was not willing to look at it. I didn't want it to be true. And, you know, it's subtle changes. You know, we talk about the chilly climate. The one definition I love is chilly climate is death by 10,000 paper cuts. You know, you can't fight one little paper cut, but it's just a wearing down sort of issue. So anyway, WISE we have the undergraduate peer mentoring program, which is about 200 young women, undergrads. The learning community is about 82. We have the WISE ambassadors, which are a recognized student group, and they do a lot of outreach to K-12 schools. And one of the things we do know is that WISE women are retained in STEM careers at almost twice the national average. If they come through our program, starting as first years, we graduate them in STEM majors at about twice the national average. So, pretty good. The other part that's very interesting is we, a couple of years ago, did a survey of previous mentors in our program, and we got responses from, I don't remember what the response rate was, but it was over 300, and we'd sent out about 400. So very good. And what we found was that 81%, a little over 81%, of the young women who had graduated in science had at least one more degree. Many of them two, professional, master's, doctorate. And then for the engineers, and engineering is different. It's a professional school. You know, when you get done with your undergrad, you can go out and have a career as a PE, a professional engineer. But still 46% of them had gone on for additional degrees. So, you know, these things make us feel very good, and they keep in contact with us and tell us oftentimes that we were pretty instrumental, that they're, like all of us, there are points in time when you can make a decision to stay or go. Switch majors don't. And so what we hear often is that WISE was just there to provide the support at that juncture. And that's great. That makes me feel great.
So one of the awards that WISE administers is named for Carol FET Key, who is a former guest on this show, but also someone that you've described as a mentor. What did you learn from working with her?
Oh, Carol. When she came on the board, she was on the WISE board at first. We sort of kind of looked at each other and were kind of circling around, you know. She's a very strong personality. I can have a pretty strong personality. And we weren't really sure how this was going to work. But Carol was instrumental in helping me with some organizational problems. WISE is a terrible job in that the only people who take that job are very committed to what they're doing, and there are no boundaries. There is no 5 o'clock. There is no end of work. It's all the time. And I was really struggling with that and getting totally overwhelmed and frustrated. And so Carol and I had a meeting. It really changed my life in a lot of ways because I've used the structure that she taught me in a lot of different areas in my life. But she was able to show me, because she works in organizational theory, and a good way to try and prioritize things. And I still have it up on my desk. It's there above my computer. I see it every day. So, you know, at first when Carol was coming on the board, I thought, okay, this is great, but you know, science, I'm not really sure how this is going to work. But it was key. Because one thing we know is that people in the sciences really don't learn a lot about organization. And I'm not talking about organizing your workspace particularly. I'm talking about big picture. How do you organize? And no, I have just ultimate respect for Carol, and it was really fun when Nancy Hauserman got a hold of me about trying to get this scholarship together. So it goes back and forth every year. One year it's a WISE woman, then it's someone in business. So it's very cool. And yes, I would say Carol was a mentor. And partially, I don't see her very much all the time now, but again, every time I'm at my computer, she taught me something that affected the rest of my life.
So in 2003, you won the Jean Jew Women's Rights Award for your outstanding effort or achievement in improving the status of women at the University of Iowa. What does winning that award mean to you?
It is so humbling. It is, I'm going to get emotional. There are a lot of awards out there, and I've won a bunch of them. But this is the most significant award, at least to me, that I have not only gotten, but also because it rewards people for things that are not on the front burner all the time. It's for slogging away, you know, just really trying to every day be consistent about advocating about looking at how to change the system in incremental ways. You know, it's no flash in the pan stuff. And in an environment where rewards come from new initiatives. Everything is about, okay, look, I did this. I started this program. Isn't that cool? We don't talk about what happened, the end of it. And GNU Women's Rights Award, to me, really identifies people who just really care. They don't care as much about self-aggrandizing. You know, it's not about trying to use something as a stepping stone. So it was phenomenal. It was frighteningly wonderful. But also difficult kind of to be in the public eye. I was kind of glad when it was all over too, because I still have it on my wall, and that was great validation for me. So I don't know. Again, to me, it is one of the most significant awards that we have at the university. And I'm extremely honored to be among the recipients.
Well, so it's a Women at Iowa tradition to ask all of our guests to recommend a book or books that will help us to understand your perspective a little bit better. What would you like to add to our list?
Well, one of the books that I've become reacquainted with in the last couple of years is called The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf, and it was, I think, published in 1980. And I'd kind of forgotten about it, but I was teaching classes in gender and the workplace, and I wanted to go back because I've always remembered her chapter about the professional beauty quotient, and where she talks about how women are just caught, you know, you can't dress too feminine, you can't dress too masculine, but there's never any line. They can do whatever they want with you. You can be unacceptable no matter what you do. And also, she talked about the fact that we still make less on the dollar, but then she did this list of expenses that women have to pay and that men have to pay. Unbelievable. So then we were down to about 47 cents on the dollar. You know, it was just I thought it was an extremely well-written book. And even though, obviously, the monetary amounts are outdated, but nothing has changed. So it's kind of interesting. And I've been pulling that out and having my classes look at it. And it is entirely relevant. So anyway, that's a great one. Another book that I really like, and I cannot remember who wrote it right now, it's called Immaculate Deception. And it's just a very interesting book that looks at fertility, women, and how it's used politically, and why the foremost child psychologist in the world, Spock, Dr. was a male. How everything gets co-opted. And I remember my mother actually saying, yeah, I remember, it really used to make me mad because you'd go in to have a baby and they'd knock you out, and then you'd wake up and the doctor would come in and like he had done it. Here's your baby. And so, it was kind of looking at issues regarding fertility and, again, how they can be co-opted. But I can't remember who wrote that. That's an old one, too. We need new books.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of Women at Iowa.